All right, welcome to the conversation. We've got a great guest for you guys tonight. Gary Chambers. Gary is an activist down in Louisiana, and he lit the place on fire the other day at a school board meeting when he tore into one of the board members and demanded that they change the name of Lee High School. It used to be Robert E. Lee, now it's Lee High School, but still named after that Confederate soldier, obviously. Almost all of you know about him. But it's amazing that they still have these names. So there's a lot to talk about here. But first, Gary, welcome to TYT.
Thank you for having me, Cenk. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all. So, Gary, for folks who don't know anything about the particular controversy down in Baton Rouge, so tell us about what the meeting was, what they were trying to decide, and why you went and participated.
So, as you see from around the country, everybody's talking about Confederate monuments and removing those things. 4 years ago, myself and some of those the folks here in Baton Rouge went before the East Baton Rouge Parish School Board and asked them to change the name of what was then Robert E. Lee High School, and they changed it to Lee High School. They spent $54 million building this brand new facility, and they were still going to name it after a racist. So with all of this new traction, the conversation birthed again here in Baton Rouge. And we went and advocated for it to be done. What you saw was more of a reaction to a host of things. Connie Bernard, the school board member that you see me respond to, got on the local news here in Baton Rouge and defended Lee. She basically told the people of this community to look up his history, that he had freed the slaves, my ancestors as slaves. But the truth of the matter is Robert E. Lee was a terrible slave owner that beat people. One of the slaves in a slave narrative said that Lee was the worst man he ever met, right? And this is who Connie Bernard was telling folks the school should remain named after. And so there was a substitute motion to try to prolong the event. And when that substitute motion came up, people were ready to go. We'll be going after Connie because she sat there scrolling on the internet, shopping for dresses, while her colleague, Evelyn Ware Jackson, was sitting right next to her, passionately displaying why she thought the name of Lee High School should change. And so it infuriated me. And I thought it was important that everyone in the room be made aware that this was happening.
I think most people know Robert E. Lee, of course, was the head of the Confederate Army. And I think most people know that they were the traitors who fought against America and the vicious racists who wanted to enslave people. But I want to get into how vicious Robert E. Lee was in a second, because there's this mythology that was built in the South. That's totally wrong. But Gary, first thing, you're saying that you wanted the name changed 4 years ago. But is this a new facility? I mean, so I know that there's the monuments left over from some times, although the history of that is also mangled. Trump recently said it was put up after the Civil War. No, it was put up most of those statues during the Civil Rights era in the 1960s to basically say, know your role. When did they name it after Robert E. Lee?
So this school was originally named after Lee around the time that you're talking about, when the facility was built about 50 or 60 years ago originally. But the facility was in such a terrible condition that they tore it down and they rebuilt it. And so 4 years ago is when they were reopening Lee High School as a magnet school here in Baton Rouge. And we attempted at that point to say, hey, let's change the name now to a new name because you spent $54 million of taxpayer dollars. It's a new building. Let's leave that old legacy where it is. The school board at the time made the same decision, but they dropped Robert E. off and they just kept Lee. And so that was never satisfactory to us. I've got a 10-year-old daughter that's in the magnet programs here in Baton Rouge. And the track that she's on would potentially put her at this school. But I told my family she wouldn't go to that school unless the name was changed. And so now my daughter's a little happier because maybe she'll be able to go to Lee High School when she gets there. Well, the new name of whatever the building is when it comes forward.
Yeah, I love, I say in tongue in cheek, that they dropped the Robert E. part, as if like we don't know which Lee they were referring to. Yeah, maybe it was Bruce Lee. You don't know. Yeah.
And they even said stuff like that. They said Harper Lee. You could just put whatever name in front of it that signified it was different to you. And it's like, nah, that's not it.
No, that's not it at all. And I look, the fact that they originally named it 50, 60 years ago is super relevant. It was a lot of those buildings, the statues were erected and named after civil rights generals because they wanted to let African Americans in the South know we're still in charge. And you can get Voting Rights Act, but we're not going to let you vote. And you could get civil rights, but we're not going to allow it to happen here. And so the whole point of naming it after Robert E. Lee was to be racist, to be actively racist. So it's just unconscionable that it's still named after Lee. So, but Gary, for the folks who don't know, let's get into Robert E. Lee's actual history, because the folks in the South like to, not all of them, of course, the right wingers like to paint him as a gentleman. Well, yes, he was the head of the Confederate Army, but he was such a gentleman about it. And when he surrendered, he didn't slit anybody's throat or anything like that. And he wore gloves. What a gentleman. So who was the actual Robert E. Lee?
So Robert E. Lee, in my opinion, was one of the most treasonous people in American history. He was a strategic man of war. But if you count the bodies that were lost as a result of his leadership, right? Gettysburg, over 20,000 Confederate soldiers and over 20,000 Union soldiers died at Gettysburg as a result of this war. These slaves that were passed down to him by his wife's father upon his father-in-law passing away, thought that he was terrible. He separated families while he was a slave owner. That was one of the most egregious things you could do, was to separate a family. And Lee took no issue with it at all, right? If somebody was to be disciplined, and to even process saying that pisses me off a little bit. But if someone was to be disciplined for stepping out of line, Lee would say, lay it on them hard, and then pour brine in their wounds so that it would burn them. He was not a noble man. He was a tyrant, a brutal man, and he should not be honored in history. Thousands of people died following his leadership. And we talk about black on black crime in America, that phrasing of what we try to use, but war. What was the Civil War? White on white crime? Do we call it that, or do we glorify it and call it a war when it was really just savagery in the name of owning black people as property?
So Gary, after watching your speech, I want to remind myself about Lee. So I went and I remember talking about this on the show a long time ago, but I wanted to remember the details. So I went and looked it up. And I actually found an old newspaper article from back in the day about what he did. And so there's no dispute about it. One time, bunch of kids, they were kids, little children, had worked all day in the fields, and then they went and caught a fish afterwards because they were hungry in the river. And apparently that was not allowed, okay? So not only did you have to work for free, not only all the other atrocities that go along with it, but you're not allowed to do anything that just could give you a tiny bit of joy in the world, right? So they line up the kids to get whipped. And even the guy who does the whipping couldn't bear himself to whip the young little girl. Lee took the whip himself and whipped her until her flesh was torn from her back, and then put the salt in her wound so it stung more. He was a monster through and through. I mean, listen to what Gary said. If any of you have kids out there, imagine your kids being taken from you, and you're never, ever going to see them again. And they sold off to slavery to God knows what kind of monster and what kind of life they're going to live. So, and he was supposed to give them away. It was mandated by law, according to the will, and he would not do it. Instead, he would whip them into oblivion, and apparently seemed to enjoy it. So there shouldn't be a single thing in this country named after Robert E. Lee. So, Gary, what are they doing now? Is it definitive that they're going to change the name, and what are they considering changing it to?
So we don't know the names that are being submitted, but there's now a survey that has gone out that has received thousands of responses, as I'm told. There's a renaming committee that has been selected by the superintendent, and then there will be a meeting at some point next week that people can begin to express their views, as well as a follow-up meeting sometime in early July, in which they will end up deciding the name of the high school.
You had a couple of really great suggestions, actually, in your speech that went viral. So for those who don't know, can you tell us about the governor and lieutenant governor of Louisiana who were African-American in the 1800s?
So PBS Pinchback became the governor of Louisiana because he was the president of the Louisiana State Senate. He was elected a state senator here in the 1800s. Oscar Dunn was elected lieutenant governor, both black men. Oscar Dunn passed away while PBS Pinchback was the president of the state senate. And then Oscar Dunn, then PBS Pinchback became the lieutenant governor. The governor of the state went out under some type of scandal, which elevated PBS Pinchback to become the first black governor in the history of the United States. You never hear his name. No one ever talks about him. He was the governor of Louisiana for a 6 to 8 week period. It is my belief that seeing that a black man could become governor quickly after slavery, I believe that that's the reason that we saw Jim Crow laws come into place and the restraints that came around restricting the rights of African Americans to vote and doing everything they could to restrict our power in the Deep South for decades, right? Up until the Civil Rights Movement, where we gained voting rights and civil rights.
Yeah, look, I don't know if the right wing in the South ever actually wants to educate themselves. And then ironically, I see the bumper stickers whenever I go in the South about, oh, you should learn the real history of the Civil War and the real history of the Confederacy. Yeah, the real history is of deep, deep, deep racism, vicious terrorism towards African Americans in this country. And then obviously this board member also said it. But what's interesting is, yes, for a brief period of time, blacks got elected to office and even became the governor of Louisiana, lieutenant governor, as you point out, Gary. And then it all got stolen away again and call it what it is. It was terrorism. Certainly the biggest terrorists in the history of this country are the KKK. They terrorized millions of people, lynched, burned, you name it, right? So, okay. Now, Gary, you do the Rouge collection down there. Tell us what that is and the kind of advocacy you do in Louisiana.
So the Rouge Collection is a media platform, black-owned media platform here in Baton Rouge that myself and some friends started about 8 years ago. And we originally started it to be a more diverse version of another platform here in Baton Rouge that we felt was kind of oh so white. It didn't feature a lot of black people. Even Baton Rouge is a city that is 56% black. And so we created this platform. And then as we were developing and growing as people, the case of Trayvon Martin happened and the case of Mike Brown happened. And we began to write and advocate on a local level to have these discussions. But around 2015, there was a guy named Lamar Johnson who was in East Baton Rouge Parish Prison. He was arrested for a simple traffic stop. And that traffic stop resulted in Lamar Johnson being in the prison, and they said he killed himself. This was a few weeks before Sandra Bland. And so instead of a situation happening in Ferguson or somewhere else, it was here in my community. I wrote a column, 40,000, and as a result, I began to continue to talk about Lamar to try to find out what happened with him. About 6 months later, there was an attempt to open a misdemeanor jail here in Baton Rouge by our local district attorney, Hilla Moore. And I went before the Metro Council with Lamar Johnson's brother. His mother and father were there as well. And we fought to ensure that misdemeanor jail did not open, because the belief was if you can't maintain the prison that you already have, we don't need to create more beds to lock people up where potentially people die. And East Baton Rouge Parish Prison is one of the deadliest prisons in the country. We have a ton of deaths in East Baton Rouge Parish Prison for a host of reasons. And that's really where my advocacy started. The Rouge Collection was not intended to be that. It evolved into that because I believe when we have these media platforms that it's important that we not just talk about the fluff and the good stuff, but we've got to talk about what's important, because if people are dying in our community and we have the capacity to bring them justice, we should do everything in our power to do so.
100%. Another thing that struck me is in your speech, you talked about how that school is 87% black students. And The thought that occurred to me, Gary, is it's like sending a school that's 87% Jewish, named after Hitler or Goebbels. I mean, and so I guess in that leads me to the question of help us understand the culture down there, because this country is so diverse in the different regions that if you live in California or New Jersey, those are the two main places that I've lived, you might not understand Louisiana culture at all. So, like, to me, it's high school named after Robert E. Lee is unconscionable, but for a long, long time it was perfectly normal there. So what is that culture like?
So you can cut racism with a knife in the air in Baton Rouge. It's so thick, right? I know people see the reflection of LSU football and Coach O, who's a great Louisianan, and the football players, and think, oh, that's a place of love and kindness and generosity and good food. But I'll give you some deeper context. Black people make up 56% of the city of Baton Rouge, but we get less than 5% of city parish contracts. We don't have counties, we call them parishes. So we pay into a system that doesn't do business with our businesses. We are also the 70% of the deaths in Baton Rouge from COVID were Black. In the state of Louisiana, 70% of the COVID deaths were Black. The state of Louisiana is the second Blackest state in the country. 34% of the state is Black, yet we still get less than 5% of state contracts. And so when you think about that, and you think about people like Yusef Hamadi, a police officer who killed Jordan Frazier, 3 shots to the back, and then got his job back, and a year later shot at Raheem Howard, and Raheem Howard survived to tell about it. Yusef Hamadi is still free because the local district attorney took it to a grand jury rather than bring charges. When you talk about all of these type of incidents and you compound a school gerrymandering, right? It's 56%. That's Black parents send their kids to private schools here in Baton Rouge. We have a school board that's majority white. It's 9 seats. 5 of them are white Republicans. 4 of them are Black Democrats, although 81% of the students who attend schools in East Baton Rouge Parish School System are Black. The Metro Council in Baton Rouge is 7 white and 5 Black. 7 white Republicans, 5 Black Democrats. And so this is how we build that inequity, because even though Black people make up a sizable bit of the population, it is not reflected in the decision power. Baton Rouge only has one Black person elected parish-wide, and that is the mayor. We have never had a Black district attorney. We have never had a Black clerk of court. We have never had a Black tax assessor. And each one of these positions make critical decisions as it relates to the lives of Black people, including is just the hiring practice of these organizations. Are they reflective of the community that we live in? And so it is deeply racially divided. Call Florida Boulevard the Mason-Dixon line in Baton Rouge, because it divides North and South Baton Rouge, which is where Black folks live in North Baton Rouge for the most part, and white folks live in South Baton Rouge. And when you have these conversations around race and equity, it's just extremely problematic. And the last point I'll make is, it's not just Lee High School. Every street surrounding Lee High School is named after a Confederate general. Stewart, Pickett, Ross, Floyd, all of those streets. There's even one of the streets named Whitehaven. And there was a lady while we were filming a video a few weeks ago that told me she purchased her 1989, and in the deed restrictions to her home, it said that you could not sell the property to Black. That's how racist it is down here.
I want you to just think about it, because we've gotten so used to the horrific racism in this country. Imagine Jewish kids going to a school named after Hitler, and every street is named after Hess and Goebbels and Goering. I mean, it would just, no one would accept that. And thank God no one would accept that. So why are we asking Black kids to accept it? And it's not just Baton Rouge, it's all over the country. And then Nathan Bedford Forrest as an example. Oh, Confederate general, did you know he was good at riding horses? I don't give a damn what he was good at with horses. That guy was the Grand Wizard of the KKK. There shouldn't be a single thing named after him in the country. So, Gary, look, it's not your job to solve all the racism in the world, but if you could, renaming the streets and the schools is obviously just the first step, and they can't even do the bare minimum yet. What are the things that you think would make the biggest difference for, in literally in your neck of the woods, for Black folks in Baton Rouge, what would you have them do? You talked about contracting, et cetera, that could help the most.
So contracts are a big step, because when you talk about contracts, you talk about job creation, right? And so if you're giving 98% of the money in city parish contracts to white men, then of course hire other white men, because that's just culturally the way it goes a lot of times, if we're honest, right? Black businesses tend to hire more Black people. As a result, you'll close the income gap. Black men earn 50 cents on a dollar for every dollar that white men earn. And if my job at this point is to begin to have conversations about civic engagement and how we move people along to be more active. And so over the next few weeks and months, you're going to see me do as much as I can to teach Black folks around the Deep South how to get engaged, how to get involved, show up to do good and seek justice every corner of this country.
All right, Gary Chambers is the publisher of the Rouge Collection, and he's an advocate and activist in Baton Rouge, and had a great speech that you should check out on Facebook. But more so than that, check out the Rouge Collection. Get involved, make a difference. Gary did, and it resonated with a lot of people. And I really want to thank you for doing that and for coming on the Young Turks. We appreciate it, Gary.
I appreciate y'all. Thank you.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.